Good evening. So another voiceover video. So this is the cooling setup that is finalized in the S10 VR6 Turbo. So in the picture that's shown, it's a Mark III radiator with the Mark III fan shroud, the steel fan shroud that's just thin stamped steel, with two Derale 12-inch high output fans. So this ended up being the final setup in terms of the fan and radiator setup. And to this day, it's working really well. And there is a little secret sauce to this fan setup in the end, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So in the previous cooling video, I had talked about some of the setup that I was looking at doing in the S10, which was inclusive of Touareg cooling pipe, Touareg thermostat housing, etc. So what's pictured now is the aluminum thermostat housing that I ended up purchasing for a Mark IV 12 valve and a plastic lower housing. And I don't like the piece of plastic. I didn't like the piece of pipe that it was, or the angle of the pipe and the hose, so I had to cut the metal lower piece and then re-weld it, reposition it, as you'll see in the next few pictures. The unique thing about all of this is I bought about 3 or 4 thermostat housings to finally end up where I needed to be. I bought a Mark III one, I bought a Mark IV like GTI, I also bought the Touareg housing, so I ended up going with the Mark IV housing, the upper. I think I used a Mark III lower, and then I ended up cutting it and welding it so both the inlet and the outlet of the thermostat housing were going in the right direction for essentially the pipes that go into the radiator for the ultimate engine cooling. So it took me a little while to kind of figure all this out, kind of piece it together and figure out what worked best. But ultimately, in the end, with this aluminum housing, it doesn't leak. The welds worked out perfect, and it positioned everything just where I needed it to be to finalize all of the heater core lines as well as the radiator lines. So in the next few pictures, you'll see the heater core lines, so the one that comes out of the rear end of the thermostat housing, as well as the head, the line that comes out of the head goes to the heater core. So I constructed these all out of stainless steel, 1-inch tubing with barb fittings at the end that I had custom made. But ultimately I had redone these for this iteration of the truck. I followed more closely to the heater box and more closely to the back firewall to utilize a different rubber hose connection. So ultimately just didn't change much here, just reworked them to make sure that they fit well, and I ended up loving the way that these came out. So as mentioned earlier in the video, I used aluminum coolant pipes. These are 1.5-inch tubes with some mandrel bends that connect into the thermostat housing as well as the Mark III radiator setup. So again, I had to rework these based on the whole change in the setup with the radiator, reconstruct or buy new rubber hoses that fit really well, tie in some of the old pieces that I had. But ultimately, these work really well in the truck. I had them repowder coated wrinkle black from my friends at JPC Fabrication, and ultimately really pleased with how they came out. And there was no leaks. Everything worked out perfect, and the rubber hoses are available at AutoZone, so really easy in case something blows apart or fails, I can go get a new one. So in the next few minutes, we really get into we'll say the secret sauce of this whole cooling system. So I ended up making a custom, essentially magical coolant bubble. Instead of using the VW one just based on the positioning, used some 4-inch aluminum tubing, made some caps, bought a weld-on radiator cap fitting that I also used a 22-pound cap, and then welded it also on some fittings for the inlet kind of return, and then tied it in just like the normal special magic coolant bubble like VW uses. One goes back to the heater core, and the other one's the inlet that comes from the next piece that I'm about to show, as well as the return line for the cooling of the turbo. So if you look really close at the top of the radiator here, you can see a brass little fitting where I had to weld in a little bung in there and put a fitting in. This is that real secret sauce that I was talking about earlier in the video, where this piece actually goes back into the top of that magic bubble that I built out of aluminum. And what was ended up happening is I took the truck to the dyno one night, and the second half of the radiator did not seem to get hot. And I'm like, man, something is really weird. It's like the coolant wasn't flowing through the whole radiator. Didn't overheat, didn't show signs of being hot at all. So I had done some different tests, pressure tests, flow tests, etc. And then I had thought about it. In the previous radiator setup I had, I also had a similar type fitting, but it was in the top of like the filler neck. So I punched a hole in the radiator, welded fitting on, put this fitting on, and lo and behold, the whole radiator got hot. The truck was cooling, heating just like it's supposed to. When I go on the highway, it doesn't it's like 50, 60 degrees here in PA, so it doesn't really go over 177. I do have the higher temperature fan switch in it, but all the fans work. The single fan comes on at lower temp. At the higher temp, the dual fan comes on. It shuts off like it should. No overheating issues. So that is the secret sauce. If you're doing this type of coolant setup, you have to make sure that you have basically I'll call it a vaporized air relief, so that you can get the air out of the system and put it back in that bubble to prevent cooling issues. So the last picture here is almost the final form, where everything is wired up with the Holly. The truck is actually running. Checked the fans, made sure all the wiring checked out before I taped it all up and finalized it. This is the final form before probably the next video I make, which will be probably a running. But hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it helps. Thanks.